Well, thank you so much, Erica. Thank you, Joel. Erica says it's dumb luck. I think Erica was planning this from the start. But it's a delight to be back here. I think we started to talk about coming back 4 or 5 months ago, and I had such a great time here the last time. I didn't need to be asked twice, and I just think it's sheer fortuity that it turns out to be the day the book came out. Book is a big deal even for people who do what I do for a living. A book is something you really pour yourself into. So this is a big day, and I'm thrilled to spend it with you. And I was even more thrilled, maybe not more thrilled, but I stepped off the plane and my phone was exploding because it turned out that Rush Limbaugh had talked about the book on the radio today, and he likes it, which is important. If he's going to talk about it, you want to make sure he likes it, right? So it's just been, I was totally blown away by that. I didn't know he was going to do that. And when I got to the hotel, the first thing I did was dash him off a little note to thank him. And he is great. So, of course, he got back to me instantly. And he said, you know, there was something I forgot to say, and I'm going to hit that tomorrow. So it's a double header for me. It's just a great day all around. And while we're talking about Rush, how many you guys, married guys, will know this? How many married guys in the room? Right? Okay. So one of Rush's favorite stories or lines is, if a man's out in the forest and he's all by himself, there's nobody around, if he makes a statement, is he still wrong? And I was reminded of that today, not only because it's a great line and Rush was so great today, but because what actually got me into, or deeply into, the collusion caper, which at the time I got into it, I don't even think there was a collusion caper yet. It seemed to me that it was the Clinton emails caper, and that kind of evolved into collusion. But what made me so interested in the collusion narrative, which is what the book is about, is, and this is an uncomfortable confession to make, but it's got to be made, I was fabulously, spectacularly wrong about something that turned out to be very basic. And that is, back when I was a prosecutor, I insisted 8 ways to Sunday in a very indignant way that it was impossible, that it would never ever happen that the Justice Department and the FBI would use what are known as their counterintelligence authorities as a pretext to conduct what actually was a criminal investigation that was done without a criminal predicate. And just so you know where I'm going with this, the theory behind Ball of Collusion, and this won't be any surprise to any of you who have followed this closely all this time, is that I think there really was collusion in connection with the 2016 election, but the real collusion was not this fable about Donald Trump and Russia. The real collusion was that the Obama administration put the law enforcement and intelligence apparatus of the United States government in the service of the Hillary Clinton campaign. And that included, at its heart, exploiting the counterintelligence powers that our government is given in order to protect the United States from foreign enemies, using those powers to actually monitor the opposition campaign. And when Trump, against all odds, I think even the president himself would think it was against all odds. When he won, that investigation was used basically as a monitor on his administration to tie his hands and try to undermine his administration and make him unelectable, which I think was the main goal. Just so you get the progression, I think what happened here is you have these counterintelligence powers, and they were used as a pretext to conduct a criminal investigation without a crime. The criminal investigation was done as a pretext to spawn impeachment chatter, and the impeachment chatter is a pretext for what is the real agenda here, and that is that by sometime at the top of the autumn of 2020, their hope is to make Donald Trump unelectable. And I think that was what this is about from the beginning, and it was a political narrative from the beginning. Now, what was I so wrong about? Erica was good enough to mention that back eons ago, I think it was the Pleistocene era, I was a federal prosecutor. And toward the end of my tenure as a federal prosecutor, I started to handle national security cases. It happened not out of any planning whatsoever. The planning was done by the jihadists. They carried out the bombing of the World Trade Center in February of 1993, and it caught all of us flat-footed. Our government decided to treat a national security challenge as if it were a crime wave, and instead of the Marines at the front line, what you got was me, which is why we didn't do so hot for the first number of years, right? But I had never worked, I had been a prosecutor for a fairly long time, but I had never worked national security cases. None of us had, because they're not cases, generally speaking. When you hear national security case and you hear the expression foreign counterintelligence, these are not powers that we use, generally speaking, to create criminal cases, to develop evidence that you can present in court. The reason those powers are there is to protect the United States from threats and potential attacks by foreign powers. And the idea of these powers is to allow us to monitor those threats and try to stop bad things from happening. I'm from law enforcement. In law enforcement, what happens, it didn't happen in the Trump-Russia investigation, but what's supposed to happen in this country is a crime gets committed, and then we assign a prosecutor to investigate the crime, right? We usually don't say, there's a person, like Donald Trump, go out there and try to find a crime on him, right? Which is pretty much what we saw for the last number of years. So I knew nothing about how counterintelligence worked. And I barely knew, even though I had been a prosecutor for the better part of a decade, that the FBI actually has a night job. Aside from being our premier law enforcement agency, the FBI is also our domestic security agency. Now, what does that mean? In a lot of countries, there's a role that has to be carved out for government agencies to protect the homeland against foreign threats. And those foreign threats can come from outside attacks, or they can come from people who are foreign agents working on behalf of the foreign power operating inside the United States. In some countries, like Britain, for example, the idea is we're better off separating the law enforcement function from this national security function of protecting the country against foreign threats. In our country, what we've always thought was the best way to handle the challenge of foreign threats to security is to have both the law enforcement and that national security mission housed in the same agency, the FBI. So they have one side of their agency is the criminal law enforcement side, and the other side is what's known as foreign counterintelligence or national security. And the reason we do it that way is the idea is the two missions can actually leverage each other. One of the best ways that you can get intelligence from people is by developing criminal cases on them, because when they feel like they may be prosecuted, that gets them to talk. So sometimes our criminal prosecutions can help our intelligence mission, and it can work the other way as well. So from the time the Trade Center got bombed in about 1993 up until the 9/11 attacks, we treated terrorism essentially as a criminal justice problem, but that never made the national security component of it go away, or the national security mission. And the reason that that's important for what we're talking about tonight is, on the national security side, you have a whole different set of powers than what criminal law enforcement and prosecutors commonly use. So when I was a prosecutor, if we had a mafia case or a big drug case or something like that, and I needed to get a wiretap for my investigation working with the FBI, we would use the criminal statutes that are available. And the reason it's important to use the criminal statutes is because we're dealing in the American criminal justice system, mainly dealing with Americans, although an awful lot of non-Americans. We're all presumed innocent. And our criminal law enforcement laws that Congress has enacted account for and build in and assume all of our due process rights as Americans. So there are protections built in for people in the criminal justice rules. The national security powers in foreign counterintelligence are different in the sense that the concentration on foreign counterintelligence is not Americans. The concentration is the foreign power that may be a threat to the United States. And very often, even when we're dealing with agents of foreign powers who are here in the United States, they're non-Americans, they're working for a foreign government, they don't have the same array of rights, right? So one of the things that would happen in the 8-year interim that I mentioned was, when an investigation started, the FBI and the Justice Department would try to figure out right at the beginning, is this going to be a criminal case that we're going to try to do in court, or is this a national security case where we're just going to try to collect evidence or collect intelligence to try to protect the country? And that went on for a long time. And it really shouldn't be the kind of a thing that's a paralyzing decision to make. We should be able to go back and forth if everybody is acting in good faith. But one of the things that the Clinton Justice Department started to get very nervous about, they're nervous guys, but what they kind of wrung their hands over was the specter, the hypothetical possibility of abuse. And what kind of abuse did they have in mind? They imagined a situation in which you had a rogue agent or a set of rogue agents who didn't have enough evidence to make a criminal case, right? So rather than drop the case, which is generally what you do in the Justice Department, you know, we have lots and lots of cases. If you don't have enough evidence to make a case, you usually move on to the next one. There's not a lot of time to be doing the kind of stuff that they were worried about. But what they worried about was, what if you had rogue agents who didn't have criminal evidence, and then rather than drop the case, in order to continue investigating, because they really felt like the people that they were investigating were worthy of investigation, or maybe for corrupt reasons they wanted to try to make a case on them, that rather than drop the case, what they would do is fabricate a national security angle so that they could exploit the government's foreign counterintelligence powers and conduct what was really a criminal investigation without a criminal predicate under the guise of our national security powers. And this worry that they had that could happen, which there was no evidence of it ever having happened before, it was just something they decided to cook up and kind of worry about, That resulted in something that a number of people, I'm sure a lot of people in this room will remember, that was notoriously known as the Wall. People remember the Wall? This is a long time ago. This was all the rage and a big controversy in the mid-1990s. But the Wall was a set of regulations that the Justice Department interposed between the criminal investigation side of the FBI's house and the intelligence side, which made it impossible for those two sides as a practical matter to cooperate and compare evidence. Remember all the talk back in the day about connecting the dots and the idea that you have to know what the dots are before you can even connect them? And what we did for those 8 years was basically the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. And it was a catastrophe. It probably led to the failure of our intelligence agencies, including the FBI, to detect the 9/11 plot before it happened. Please understand what I'm saying. I'm not blaming the government for the terrorist attack. The terrorists are responsible for the terrorist attack. But our failure to detect it, our failure to do efficient intelligence collection and analysis was because we put this cockamamie administrative wall between the two sides, and it was a disaster for Americans in terms of our security, because we couldn't get the full measure of what they call the threat mosaic. We couldn't understand where the threats were coming from. And a lot of people died. So, back when the wall was first established, there was a lot of controversy in the Justice Department. And it pitted a number of people who were working terrorism cases like myself, who objected to it vigorously at the time. And for one thing, the objection was on the basis of our honor. You know, basically we're saying, you're saying that if we have these powers to protect the United States at our disposal, that we will use them, we'll lie to the court, we'll use them pretextually, which is we were pretty indignant about that, and I think that seemed understandable at the time. But the other thing, the more practical thing, and this is what now we finally get to what I was so wrong about. If you assumed a rogue agent, I thought it was absolutely absurd to think that a rogue agent, no matter how bad, would ever exploit counterintelligence powers to fabricate a criminal case. And the reason I was so confident about that wasn't because I think everybody's an angel and nobody would ever do something they shouldn't do. The reason was it didn't make sense for them to do it. If you assumed a rogue, there's a whole different layer and set of rungs of approvals that you have to go through in the government and in the Justice Department to use the national security powers. They're not easy. You have to get a ton of approvals. So from where I sat, and this was as somebody who was working day to day with the people who were doing these cases, if you had a rogue agent and rogue prosecutors or whoever, it would be much easier for them to fabricate evidence to try to use the criminal procedures than to fabricate a national security angle to try to use those powers. And what I said again and again was that would be crazy to do because the Bureau would never let anyone get away with it. And if the Bureau let them get away with it, the Justice Department would be there to backstop it. So I was absolutely certain it couldn't happen because you would have to get too many approvals. There'd have to be too many people in on it. So why was I so wrong? What I failed to assume was that there could be a case where the rungs of approval, the adult leadership, the people who run the organization, actually decide to do the investigation themselves. You know, the idea in the Justice Department and in the FBI, and it's a very good idea, is that we want investigations to be conducted in the places where either a threat to the United States exists or where the crime happens. That's not only consistent with the Constitution, it also is good practice for two reasons. One, the people who are closest to the event are always going to be the most efficient in gathering the evidence of it. They're going to have the best contacts. They're going to have the best knowledge of the community. But the other thing that the FBI and the Justice Department want is for investigations to happen independent of the politics of Washington. If the FBI headquarters does an investigation, they're right there in the thick of all the politicking. So the idea is we want to insulate investigations from those kinds of considerations. So for that reason, what the FBI likes to do and what the Justice Department likes to do is have investigations carried out in the district office where the relevant crime happened or the evidence is, and then the FBI and the Justice Department's headquarters can play the traditional role that headquarters is supposed to play, which is they're the leadership, they're the guardians of our standards, they make sure that everybody stays on the straight and narrow. I can tell you, having been a prosecutor for 20 years, there has never been a prosecutor, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone who ever spent 5 minutes doing what I used to do. There's never been anyone who hasn't been tempted to press the envelope in their own cases. When you're working on an investigation, especially if you're dealing with something like terrorism or violent crime, you become convinced that your bad guys are the worst bad guys in the history of bad guys. And you rationalize. You want to cut corners. You want to say, you know, why do I have to satisfy this threshold? Because what I'm dealing with here is a real problem with really bad people. And even if I don't have all the evidence I need, if we get a wiretap, we'll get the evidence and we'll figure it all out. You want to cut corners. Not because you're a bad person, because you convince yourself that you're dealing with evil, and this is the higher calling. This is the better way to deal with it, right? And because we're all human, and because we're all subject to that temptation, we need to have supervision there, which is detached, and which tells us, no, we don't do that kind of stuff. You know, we don't take an opposition research screed from somebody who is working for a political campaign and is operating on hearsay information that's 2 and 3 times removed from the facts, and we don't slap a caption on the front of that and bring it to court and say, here's our warrant. We don't do that kind of stuff. You're supposed to have your supervision there to say, we have rules that say, for example, if you want to go to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which is the court that handles national security cases, you must verify the information before you submit an application to the court. And while that is always important, it's always critical for the honor of the Justice Department and the credibility of the Justice Department with the court, it's always important to corroborate your information before you bring it to a court. It's especially important in foreign counterintelligence. In FCI investigations, what we're allowed to do is monitor people who the government says there's probable cause, not that they committed a crime necessarily, but that they are agents of a foreign power, that they are operating on behalf of a foreign power in the United States in a clandestine way against our people and against our government and against our nation. That's what these powers allow us to do. They are intelligence gathering powers. They are not, again, for building a criminal investigation. You know why that's important? Criminal investigation keeps people honest. In a criminal investigation, it's true that if I went to get a search warrant, or I went to get a wiretap, or I went to get some other source of information where there was something in the law that allowed me to go to a court and get an order that compelled someone to surrender the evidence to me, it's true that I was allowed to go to the judge with my agent by ourselves. No defense lawyer there, no defendant there, no suspect there, just us and the judge. But in a criminal investigation, everybody operates under the assumption that eventually there's going to be a trial. Eventually there's going to be a prosecution. Eventually, the reason we're doing this is we're going to file an indictment and we're going to arrest people. And when we arrest people, all the representations that we make to the court in order to get evidence are going to be turned over to the defense and to the defense lawyers. And they are going to go over every single line of every single submission to see, did we mislead the court? Did the court apply the correct evidentiary standard? Every single motion attacking the underlying basis for collecting evidence is going to be fleshed out. So it's not that people who work in criminal law are more honest than other people. They know it's in their self-interest to be straight with the court, because if they're not, someone's going to find out about it down the road. And if that happens, there are going to be repercussions. That's not how it works in foreign counterintelligence. In FCI, because we're only there to gather intelligence, we're not looking to make a case against somebody down the road, what the Justice Department and the FBI are allowed to do is go to a secret court that Congress created in 1978 and present an application that says that the person they want to surveil, or the person they want to monitor, the person they want to spy on, is an agent of a foreign power. The only due process, let's say you have an American, let's say you have Carter Page, as we had in the Trump-Russia investigation. You have an American citizen who they want to say is operating as an agent of Russia. The only due process that American is ever going to get is if the Justice Department and the FBI play it straight with the court, and the court forces them to comply with their own regulations, which include making sure that you bring verified information only to the court. And if they don't follow their own rules, and if the judge don't make them follow their own rules, then you basically have a dragnet. You have surveillance going on against people who are presumed innocent and who have a full array of constitutional rights, and they never find out about it. And what we found out in this investigation was that was precisely what they did, but they did it for the purpose of monitoring a political campaign. That's what this was about, through and through. When I started to write what became Ball of Collusion, ultimately, I had a different idea about what it was going to be. I thought the way to do this is to compare the Hillary Clinton emails investigation with the Trump-Russia investigation and ask whether any objective person could look at both of them and say that the same degree of justice was afforded to both sides. To take the case where they bent over backwards not to make the case, where they had a mountain of evidence of criminal activity. You know, in the Mueller investigation, you lied to the FBI, you got prosecuted. The Clinton investigation, you lied to the FBI, they gave you a medal and immunity. Right? No grand jury to speak of. Right? Make all kinds of arrangements. In the Mueller investigation, they showed up at 6 o'clock in the morning or before. If they needed to break into your house, they broke into your house, but they grabbed the evidence they wanted, right? In the Clinton investigation, they said, pretty please. And if the person said no, they would make a deal to get the evidence but not look at it, or not look at big sections of it. I mean, you're talking about a situation where they bent over backwards not to make a case versus, when they actually had real criminal evidence, versus scorching the earth to try to find a case where there wasn't one. And after 2 years, they still weren't able to do it. So my idea was to try to compare these two investigations and just pose that question. Whether you're a liberal or a conservative, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, can you honestly look at these two investigations and say, by the way, these two investigations, which were conducted by the same agents, the same investigators, the same Justice Department personnel, and say that they did blind justice? there's not a chance, right? So that was my idea. And I think over time I got away from it. And the reason I didn't get completely away from it, but it just turned out to be the hardest thing for a writer about something like this is to try to write something about a story that isn't over yet, where it's all a moving target and you don't know if you plant your feet and say this is what happened, you find out 3 weeks after the book comes out or 3 hours before the book comes out, and Russia isn't there to help you. You find out that you were wrong about something. And I've been wrong about enough, if I haven't been clear enough about that. So the challenge here, I think, became to try to break off a piece of this that it was sensible to treat, that you could explain what really happened, and that it was important enough to rate writing a book about. And I think the collusion narrative fits all that. And what I hope people take away from the book is a couple of things. Number one, the collusion narrative that was spun for you never had a chance of being true. It's not just that it wasn't true, it never had a chance of being true. It was built on things that were absolutely false and preposterous. Beginning with the idea, have you noticed that, they talk about Paul Manafort as the big linchpin of all this, right? The guy who, he was Trump's campaign chairman for a few months, and he had years and years that he dealt with Ukrainian oligarchs who, were darkly described as tied to the Kremlin and all that jazz. Do you notice that Mueller threw the book at Manafort? I mean, everything you can imagine, tax evasion, money laundering, stuff that they never prosecuted before, like failing to register as a foreign agent, something that had been prosecuted, I think, half a dozen times in 50 years before they used it in this investigation. You ever notice what they never charged him with? They never charged him with being an agent of Russia. Think about that. This is the guy that the whole thing is built on, right? Again and again. I mean, it's one thing to say that they never brought a collusion case against him. They never even alleged that he was an agent of Russia, the guy that this whole thing is built on. So there are a number of things that are strewn throughout this, not just the Steele dossier, which is sometimes, if it wasn't so serious, some of it is laugh out loud false. But this thing, it's not just that they didn't have a case. They never had a chance of making this theory. And I believe that Mueller must have known that very soon after he took over the case. The second thing, and I'll leave it at this so we can have some dialogue back and forth. The second thing is I'm hoping that this collusion narrative gets placed in a context that maybe we haven't thought about up until now. We've been so focused on the collusion story in a vacuum. I thought it was necessary, or would be at least valuable, to put it in context. And what I try to demonstrate in the book is that the Obama administration had an 8-year record of politicizing intelligence and using law enforcement processes to punish political enemies and scapegoats. So the question is, when it got to the Hillary campaign losing ultimately to Trump, and they needed a rationale for why they lost, why would anyone think that they wouldn't be able to come up with one? Because this is what they do. And the last thing I'll say about that is this. Let me bring you back to the last candidate debate between Clinton and Trump, right? At one point, Hillary screeches. No, she was probably just speaking. I heard it as a screech. But she said something along the lines of horrible or horrifying. You know what she was talking about? She was talking about Trump refusing 3 weeks before the election to say that the election was absolutely legitimate. Trump was there saying it could be rigged. And she's saying, well, in American tradition, we always say the voters speak and then everybody accepts the results. Can't you accept the results? And he said, nah, you know, I'm not going to accept the results until after I see what happens in the election. And she said, this is just unbelievably horrifying that somebody could question the legitimacy of, he's attacking our democracy. And when she was finished saying he was attacking our democracy, Obama went out on the stump the next day and said the same thing. He's attacking our democracy. He won't accept the legitimacy of our election. Now, the reason I want you to remember that is this. In real time, as it was going on, the FBI and the intelligence agencies of the government, the CIA in particular, knew, as it was happening, what Russia was doing to meddle in the election. They knew, going back to 2015, that Russia had wheedled its way into the Democratic email accounts, right? Brennan was the head of the CIA. He said that he confronted his counterpart in the Russian government in August of 2016. And then Obama, in September of 2016, glared at Putin and said, we know what you're doing. Stop! We're not going to put up with that, right? Now, when Hillary Clinton reamed out Trump, and Obama did afterwards for the last 3 weeks of the campaign, saying, how on earth could you question the legitimacy of our elections? Understand, they knew everything we now know about Russia's interference in the election. There's nothing that we've learned, whether it's through Mueller's investigation or through what the CIA and the other agencies put out in January of 2016, there's nothing that we've been told that's important about Russia's operations against the election that they didn't know when she was standing there staring at Trump saying, how could you question whether this is legitimate? So you heard about collusion for one reason. She lost. Thank God. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to your questions.
This is interesting. Has anyone from inside any of these agencies acknowledged what's right and what's wrong? Are they coming clean? Are they still obfuscating? Or how can you, I realize it's under investigation, but whatever you can say about that.
Well, it's interesting. Michael Horowitz, who is the Inspector General at the Justice Department, which is an office that reports to both Justice and the Congress, we were told by Attorney General Barr, I think it was back in April, that Horowitz's investigation, he's looking at the FISA abuse and other things, that it might be finished as early as May. It's still going on. What you hear in Washington is the reason it's still going on is more people came forward to provide more information. If that's true, I attribute it to Attorney General Barr creating a serious tone and making it clear to people that he actually does intend to get to the bottom of this. He's not just saying he's going to get to the bottom of it. So I think that's why that's been delayed, and I'm hoping in early to mid-September we'll hear from Horowitz and we'll be able to answer that one easier then.
Yeah, for those of us who are old enough to remember Watergate, which is probably most of this, do you see this when it all comes out? Will it be as big as Watergate, not as big? I understand the media is a lot different than it was for that.
I mean, the problem with the Watergate comparison is it's such a different media environment today than it was in 1972, 73, 74. And it's such a big difference in terms of a scandal when the media is the wind at your back versus the wind in your face. So, I mean, if some of the things that happened here are what's alleged to have happened here, and these powers got abused and there was spying that was done on the campaign, that should be one of the biggest scandals in American history. Do I think it'll be treated that way? I hope it'll be treated that way in the history books if that's how it comes out, but I'm not holding my breath for the media to treat it that way. I would note, though, and this I think is worth noting, you know, we talk about the media all the time, but they lose a lot. I mean, Trump is president, notwithstanding that the media pushed against him with all of its might, and they're going to do it again. But I bet you, if you got to ask the president what one of the best things he has going for him is, he would say that his attacks on the media and the unfairness of the coverage really does resonate with people. So I think there's pushback against the media. They're much more openly ideological than they used to be. But also, you know, between Fox News and National Review and a lot of the alternative media we have, plus the internet giving us the ability to research things on our own, I just don't think the media punches above its weight the way it used to.
We have some questions which, of course, relate together, and one specifically was, well, if Mueller knew 2 years ago, why did he keep going? Understanding that on the public side, we're getting saturated. So it was, unless he, to my mind, unless he came up with something huge, it would be, well, that's all old news now. And also along those lines, why didn't the FISA judge complain?
Yeah. So let me take the first part first, and then we'll get to the FISA judges. You know, remember the famous text between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page where they talk about the insurance policy, right? And the idea was that in the highly, highly unlikely event that Trump won, they needed an insurance policy. Well, an insurance policy is not something we all know, right? Insurance policy is not there to prevent the bad thing from happening, right? The insurance policy kicks in after the bad thing has happened. And the bad thing here, from their perspective, was Trump being elected president. And the insurance policy, I believe, was to have an investigation that would be a monitor on Trump and that would straitjacket him in terms of his pursuit of parts of his agenda that the powers that be in the Obama administration, many of whom carried over into the next administration, in their infinite wisdom decided were bad for America, right? As if we elected them instead of Trump. So, you know, the reason I think the investigation continued is because the point of it was not necessarily to make a case as it was to, I mean, they were hoping to make a case, but they wanted, I think, to have that monitor on Trump. And here's something I think is very interesting. They went back to get FISA warrants on Carter Page, and each FISA warrant, by the way, says that the FBI believes Carter Page and perhaps others connected to Donald Trump's campaign were involved in Russia's cyber espionage. So they come right out and say that. They got FISA warrants 4 times. The last time they went back to get one, I believe, was June of 2017. That's about a month or so after Mueller took the investigation. I think he's still sort of getting his arms wrapped around it. The reason I mention this is they would have been due to go back to the FISA court in September to get the warrant if they were going to extend it on Page. And to do that, that would have required them to reaffirm all the things that were in the Steele dossier. And they didn't do that. They pulled the plug on the investigation. So I always kind of look at that as the point in time that we can know that they really knew that this was not, this whole idea of Trump and Russia having a conspiracy to steal the election was bogus.
There's a bunch of, again, cards which have the same theme with them. If I mention the names Brennan, and Clinton and Obama and some of these sort of bad actors, will anything happen to them?
Yeah, you know, that's the big question that everybody has. My attitude about this is twofold. Number one, what we really need to find out is what happened, you know, and if we get a solid accounting of what happened, if it turned out that people violated the law in a way that's prosecutable, you can deal with it at that point. But the last time I wrote a book where I didn't show up in Silicon Valley the night that it came out, it was a book about impeachment. And I didn't have the foresight to wait till Trump was president to write an impeachment book. Maybe it would have made a couple of bucks, actually. But one of the things that struck me while I was doing the research for the book is that a lot of things that are in the nature of abuse of power are not actually violations of the criminal code. Most things, in fact, well, maybe most things overstates it, but you get my point. There's a lot of power that government officials have that they have broad discretion to use, and where you find abuse of power is usually where the government official is abusing the discretion that the law allows them. The reason that is worth noting is because criminal statutes are kind of black and white. You know, they're constitutionally, they're supposed to be written, as they say, so that a person of ordinary intelligence knows what's forbidden. In a good criminal statute, you don't really have a lot of room for judgment. You know, like bank robbery. You know, there's no judgment involved. You either rob the bank or you don't. Whereas, you know, with the exercise of government authorities, like, should I unmask somebody whose identity has come up in intelligence reporting? Well, the law says I can do it if it's necessary in order to understand the intelligence significance of the reporting. Well, who decides that? And if I abuse my authority on that, who's going to say that's criminal? And maybe if I do it 100 times and it's a pattern, that's one thing, but if I do it once or twice, is that a crime? So that's, you know, I don't mean to trivialize abuses of power, because in point of fact, they're a lot more important to the country than mere crimes, because abuses of power are offenses against all of us. That's why the framers did not require an indictable criminal offense in order to impeach an office holder. What they basically say is if you abuse your power, you can be removed.
This is a wonderfully simplistic question. When it's all said and done, did Russia do that much?
Well, you know, I don't think so. I think a lot of it has been overstated. People throw stuff at you in some of the places where I go when you say that. But, you know, Russia did what Russia does, and this is really what Obama said right after the election, until they flipped the switch and decided that this was the crime of the century. We had like that 5 minutes of time where, you know, they basically said it wasn't, you know, you can't steal a federal election, at least as it's presently constituted, because we don't have a federal election. We have 50 different state elections, and they all have different rules and the like. But the other thing, and I try to make this point in the book, two things to think about with this. Number one, Russia has been interfering in American elections and Western elections since the Bolshevik Revolution. They do this all the time. They always do it, right? This time it got the media's attention because it didn't happen to be designed to help Democrats. You know, it was historic. But you know, the fact is that this is what Russia does. Russia's a lousy, awful regime, and this is the kind of stuff they do. And because we're now a cyber techno society, they're advancing their tools, but they're not doing anything they didn't always do. They always try to disrupt and meddle and the like. The second thing about that is the country that I think more than any other in the world interferes in the affairs of other countries is ours. That's a fact. We interfere in Russia's elections. In fact, one of the reasons that Putin was supposedly whipped up about 2016 is because he thought Hillary Clinton interfered in Russian affairs back in 2011 in their elections. Obama tried to knock off Bibi Netanyahu. Clinton has publicly said that he did years before. Obama tried to derail Brexit, right? He said that, you know, if they do it, the British people are going to be at the back of the queue, as he put it. You know, this is what, I know you're not supposed to say this, but this is what great powers and even not so great powers do in the world when they're dealing with foreign governments that have interests that are of consequence to our interests. We try to influence them. And we do it, and I think one of the really bad things about what's gone on for the last 2 or 3 years is this is going to make life much harder for American intelligence agents who have to operate in dangerous parts of the world doing what we want them to do, which is gather intelligence and also interfere with the plans of rogue governments that might harm the United States.
Well, when you talk about Russia and collusion, the next possible step on the parts of some Americans is impeachment. Are there any grounds there? I know that word gets used very loosely, but if you could discuss that, please.
Yeah, so there is a standard for impeachment, high crimes and misdemeanors. The framers had a very solid idea of what they meant by it. They had a contemporary example in Edmund Burke's impeachment of Hastings, who was the Governor General, British Governor General in India. And Hamilton writes about them. He says basically that they are political offenses, and what he means by that are they are abuses of power that are directed at the body politic, not ordinary crimes. And they're much more in the nature of, I've always thought they're much more in the nature of military law than federal civil penal law. You know, ideas like conduct unbecoming, abuse of power, dereliction of duty, that sort of thing. So we do have an understanding, people who say high crimes and misdemeanors, what does that mean? We do have an understanding of what it means in a constitutional sense. Now, also down here on planet Earth, it was about 1970 when Gerald Ford was the minority leader of the House of Representatives, and they were trying to impeach William O. Douglas, who was a justice of the Supreme Court, and that he was asked about what an impeachable offense is. And what Ford said was an impeachable offense is whatever the House of Representatives decides it is at a given moment in history. Now, in a raw, cynical, sheer politics sense, that's true. They can file articles of impeachment about anything. All they need to do, articles of impeachment, unlike removing the president, which happens in the Senate trial, articles of impeachment only require a simple majority in the House of Representatives to be filed. You need a 2/3 supermajority in the Senate to remove the president. And that high requirement for removal has historically meant that we've had almost no impeachment. I mean, we've had less than a handful of experiences with impeachment. And for the most part, it's because even in the House, if people think that a president deserves to be impeached, they realize it's futile to try if the politics in the Senate won't allow for it to happen. So I've always thought the framers' design here is ingenious because the supermajority means that no president will ever be removed unless the conduct is so egregious that people on all sides of the ideological spectrum and the partisan divide can agree that the president needs to be removed. And I don't think we're anywhere close to that.
Someone wants to know when we can expect the audiobook. Just I'll throw that in there.
That's a great question. You know, I think this one's a kind of a long book, so it might take a while to get around to that. I hadn't even thought about that, so thank you for that question. I'll take that up with Roger Kimball, who's my publisher.
So a couple that go together regarding the FBI. Can its reputation come back, or maybe it shouldn't? And would any of the higher-ups in the FBI or DOJ face prosecution when it all comes down?
Well, as far as the prosecution goes, I'll just repeat briefly what I said before, which is let's find out what happened first, and then we'll see whether there's anything prosecutable. As far as the reputation of the FBI, it's taken a hit, you know, and when your reputation takes a hit, it takes a while to rebuild it. Now, I agree with what Attorney General Barr has said about this, which is that from what he's been able to detect so far, it seems to him that if there was a failure here, it was at the at the managerial ranks of the Bureau and the Justice Department, not the rank and file where most of the scut work of most investigations is done. I'm also sensitive to something I thought profound that Victor Davis Hanson wrote, I want to say about 2 months ago, which is that a lot of the worst of what we've seen in the conduct of some of the FBI agents, I think Victor was talking in particular about Peter Strzok and Andrew McCabe, he noted that they came up through the ranks. And he deduces from that that there may be something that's endemic in the agency that you know, when it finally rises to the managerial level, it's problematic. My experience in government is when you bring good people in, that has an electric effect through an agency. And when you have people who are not so good, then people run amok and you see some of the worst things that you fear.
Sorry, here. This is related to the reaction. The question was, will President Trump, has he been fighting back? And what can one do in that situation?
Well, I've been saying from the beginning of the administration that I think what he could have done, there has never been a day since Donald Trump was president when he could not have declassified and unsealed and publicized any of the intelligence files that he thought were necessary in order for the public to understand what happened here. Now, there may be a variety of good reasons why he hasn't done that. I talk in the book about this. You know, for one thing, the way this insurance policy was designed, every time Trump did anything to fight back, the other side said he was obstructing the investigation. So it's a very convenient little box they put him in, right? And if he had unsealed and put out publicly a bunch of information, the next thing that would have been squealed was that he was obstructing the investigation and undermining Mueller's ability to question witnesses without people having their story straight and the like. I wasn't terribly overblown by that explanation, terribly persuaded by it, but I see the sense of it. The other thing I would caution people, and this is just on the basis of having written about a zillion search warrant affidavits and wiretap affidavits and the like, every investigation has a theory of the case. And what you write to a court in order to get permission to do a search of any kind, whether it's wiretapping or a physical search or, you know, search somebody's house, the submission that you make to the court is going to tend to echo your theory of the case, right? The FBI and the Justice Department's theory of the Trump-Russia case is that Trump was bought and paid for by Putin, and that Putin had him compromised, whether it was in a personal nature or, you know, through other varieties of corruption, whether it's financial corruption, political corruption, and so on. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that these things happened. What I'm saying is, if that was the FBI's theory of the case and the Justice Department's theory of the case, what do you think their underlying submissions and memoranda are going to say? They're going to be a reflection of that theory. So even if it's not true, even if the things that they said about Trump being in Putin's pocket aren't true, if that information sees the light of day, it's not going to be flattering to the president. And there are a certain percentage of people, we all know this, who, whether something is true or not, is beside the point, right? Can it be used by the tribe? Does it help our side? That's the only thing that's of importance to them. And for that reason, I think, you know, the president may be gun shy about putting out information. And a third thing, the final thing I'll say is, what you notice looking hard at the collusion fable and the Trump-Russia investigation is there's an awful lot of participation by foreign intelligence services. And when we take information from foreign intelligence services, whether we should take it or not, whether they're in the wrong or not, we take it pursuant to agreements that we have with them, that we are never going to compromise the information or where we got it from. So I am sure that part of what's going on behind the scenes that we don't see but we hear a little bit about is there's probably a brawl between the political people and the intelligence people. The political people would probably like to get a lot of this information out, and the intelligence people are telling them, if we put this information out, it's going to rupture our relationship with X, Y, and Z government. And that's not a small thing, because we actually do rely on our partners for purposes of security. So it's a big problem.
Well, it was only a matter of time. Was Epstein's death a suicide?
I'll never tell. One thing I can say about, I worked for about, it sounds awful to say this, I worked about a quarter century in the government, and what I've learned is never to assume nefarious conspiracies when sheer incompetence is a possible explanation. So I see nothing in this equation that I've seen so far to depart at all from that rule. The MCC, the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York, is not as terrible as what some of the stories that you've been reading in the last week or so indicate. Compared to a lot of state prisons, it's nirvana, probably. But as federal prisons go, it's a lousy prison. It's got about 800, it's what we call a holding facility in federal parlance. I think the state uses the same thing. And that's to distinguish it from what would be like a designation prison. And the distinction is, the holding facility is the place you keep people while their cases are pending. You know, they have to be able to meet with their lawyers, they're still presumed innocent, they haven't gone to trial yet, they haven't pled guilty. Whereas after you're guilty, then they send you to some penitentiary someplace. And the rules are much different. And the MCC tends to be grossly understaffed. The stories that I'm reading in the last week about not only people being forced to work overtime day after day after day, but also taking people who actually weren't trained prison guards and putting them in that position, that did not surprise me to read that stuff. What I think people ought to be angry about, and the answer to the question is yes, I think he committed suicide, and until we see something that indicates something to the contrary, I'm going to believe that. But Epstein's, and Rich Lowry wrote a great piece about this either yesterday or today. I just saw it today. But the thing that ought to make people really rabidly angry about Epstein is how he was accommodated by the system at every step of the way. From the time that he was committing these atrocities, when he was given a slap on the wrist by the Florida authorities, and even better than a slap on the wrist from the federal authorities, to the very end when evidently he tries to commit suicide, or at least there are indications of that 2.5 weeks ago, and his lawyers, his high-power lawyers, come marching into the prison, and they demand that the suicide watch be taken off him. And the prison accommodates him. How do you accommodate a guy? If you really thought that he might have committed suicide 2 weeks ago, you don't accommodate him. I wouldn't even have entertained a meeting with the lawyers about that. So it just seems to me, you know, Erica and I were talking about this before, and a number of the people we were talking to earlier, this whole idea, and I started with this tonight, so it's probably fitting to get to it again. This idea of two standards of justice. You know, the two-tier system where people who are insiders and connected, or at least friendly to the powers that be, get one quality of justice, and everybody else gets a different quality of justice. And what's really sickening with Epstein is that every step in the way he got a real high quality of justice that the rest of us certainly couldn't expect to get.
Couldn't resist. Had one of those. And I see people are starting to line up for your book, so we'll end it with, as all these evenings do, with predictions, non-binding. Will President Trump be reelected, and against whom will he run?
I think, yes, he'll get reelected. There's a long way between, here and there. And I don't know that we've seen the entire Democratic field yet. I know, this is not my
Sure.
area. There are a lot of people at National Review who'd be better on this than I would. I have a feeling about Warren. I have, in some ways, it's a hope that she's the candidate. But I just think that, from what I've seen up until now, I think she presents well. I think her ideas are nuts, but she's thoughtful about them, and she has an energy. I don't think Biden is. I don't think Biden is a serious candidate. I mean, it's hard to say somebody's not serious when they've been the front runner for so long. But let's see when they. Let's see whether he's got a glass jaw or not. So,
And then
anyway.
finally, some people have said, thank you so much for coming, and thanks for your candor. I think we all feel that. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Andy McCarthy.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.